Wife said, "He awakened passion in me, and you're just a boring husband." My response left her stunned. Welcome to Positive Voices. Please like this video and subscribe Positive Voices. Let's begin. I always thought I had a handle on what lay ahead. Life, marriage, and the slow but steady march of time. None of it seemed unpredictable, but I was wrong. For months, the signs were there, glaringly obvious in hindsight. Addison, my wife of 10 years, had grown distant. Her laughter came less frequently, her touch felt mechanical, and intimacy had all but disappeared. At first, I convinced myself it was stress. Work was demanding, and life had thrown its fair share of challenges our way. But deep down, I knew better. There was something more, something lurking beneath the surface of her cold indifference. It wasn't long before the pieces began to fall into place. Her late nights, the sudden care she put into her appearance, the whispered phone calls. It all painted a picture I didn't want to see. I resolved to confront her, but not in anger. If she was done with our marriage, then I would let her go. As painful as it was, I couldn't force her to stay. But what puzzled me was her refusal to leave, her insistence on dragging things out as though waiting for something. Financially, things were straightforward. The house we lived in had been a gift from my grandmother, left to me after her passing. The title was under my father's name, a precaution I had taken years earlier, anticipating that things might one day go wrong. It wasn't just her indifference that unsettled me. It was a deliberate way she avoided being in the same space for too long. Conversations became monosyllabic exchanges. Meals were eaten in silence, and the warmth we once shared had been replaced with a cold, formal distance. There were moments I caught myself staring at her, searching for a flicker of the woman I'd fallen in love with. But the Addison I knew was gone, replaced by someone whose eyes seemed to hold secrets too heavy to share. The worst part was the waiting. It was as if we were both standing on the edge of a precipice, neither willing to make the first move. She lingered, hovering between staying and leaving, while I tried to piece together while she was holding on. I sought advice from my parents one evening, after an especially tense dinner. My father was a pragmatic man, his words always laced with a blunt wisdom that cut through the noise. "Michael," he said, leaning back in his chair, "if you think she's pulling away, you've got two choices. You either fight for her or you protect yourself. It's that simple." My mother chimed in, her voice softer, but no less firm. "Keep the house in our name for now. If things fall apart, you'll thank us later." At the time, I didn't fully understand the weight of their advice. But looking back, it was one of the few decisions that kept me from losing everything. The strain in our marriage reached a breaking point the night. I came home to find Addison sitting at her vanity, her movements deliberate as she applied makeup. Her dress was new, short, revealing, and completely unlike anything I'd ever seen her wear. She didn't acknowledge my presence. Her reflection in the mirror focused entirely on her own image. "Going somewhere?" I asked, my voice calm despite the storm brewing inside me. "Yes," she replied flatly. "I have a date." The words hung in the air, sharp and unyielding. I stared at her, waiting for her to laugh, to reveal this as some cruel joke. But she didn't. She simply continued with her makeup, as if what she'd said was the most natural thing in the world. "A date?" I repeated, my voice laced with disbelief. "While we're still living under the same roof." She turned to face me, her expression defiant. "I made up my mind, Michael. I deserve this, and I'm not leaving." Addison's words hung in the air, daring me to challenge her. For a moment, I simply stared at her, my mind reeling. Her audacity was staggering, but what unsettled me more was the cold certainty in her eyes. She wasn't asking for permission. She was declaring her intent. "You're not leaving," I repeated, my voice calmed but firm. "So, you think you can date while living in my house?" "It's our house," she corrected, turning back to the mirror. "And yes, I do." I clenched my fists, willing myself to stay composed. "No," I said finally. "You can date after you've moved out. Not before." She froze, her lipstick poised in midair. Slowly, she turned to face me, a mocking smile curling at her lips. "And what if I say no? Then pack some things and stay somewhere else for a few days." I said evenly, "I'll figure out the rest, and we can discuss splitting everything later." She laughed, a sharp, bitter sound. "I'm not going anywhere, Michael. I like this house, and when it's mine, I'll redecorate it however I please." Her arrogance was infuriating, but I kept my voice steady. "You're the one who's leaving, Addison, not me." Her smile vanished, replaced by a cold glare. "We'll see about that," she said, her tone venomous. "And don't think about coming back while I'm gone. If you do, I'll call the police and have you arrested. They'll hold you for 48 hours on a domestic violence charge. And by the time you're out, I'll have changed the locks." She expected me to falter, to crumble under the weight of her threat, but I simply smiled. "Make sure your lipstick matches the ring on the tube," I said calmly as I turned and walked away. I headed to the garage, my mind racing, her brazen attitude, her blatant disregard for the life we'd built. It was enough to push anyone over the edge. But instead of lashing out, I focused on the task at hand. If she thought she could waltz out of the house for a date, she was sorely mistaken. I grabbed my aluminum baseball bat and swung it with precision, shattering the headlights and taillights of her car. For strikes were all it took to render the vehicle unusable. I stood back, the faint sound of metal settling filling the space. Inside, her purse sat on the counter, her phone poking out. I rifled through it, finding packs of rubber bands and the device itself. Without hesitation, I carried the phone to the workbench and smashed it with a hammer, ensuring it wouldn't be her lifeline tonight. I left the rubber bands untouched. She wouldn't accuse me of theft if they were still there. By the time Addison entered the kitchen, dressed in towering heels and a smirk that screamed defiance, I was sitting calmly with a cup of coffee. She froze when she saw me, her eyes narrowing. "Get out," she demanded, pointing toward the door. "Why would the police come?" I asked evenly. "I haven't threatened you. I haven't touched you. I've simply refused to leave my own home." Seething, she stormed out of the room. Minutes later, I heard her frustrated scream echo from the garage. "What did you do to my car?" she shouted. "Why assume I did anything?" I called back, feigning innocence. "Maybe you shouldn't leave it out on the street." She returned moments later, clutching her heels and muttering curses under her breath. "Enjoy your night," I said with a slight smile as she stormed out the door. From the living room window, I watched Addison stomp down the street, her heels dangling from one hand, her foam-less frustration visible even from a distance. She knocked on the first neighbor's door, then another, each time being turned away. It was almost entertaining, watching her desperation grow as she moved further down the block. I'd already taken precautions. Earlier, I called my mother, who reached out to our longtime neighbors to let them know what was happening. They were all on my side, and Addison's repeated attempts to rally their support proved fruitless. After about 20 minutes of wandering and rejection, she returned, lingering in the shadows at the edge of the property. I leaned back in my chair, knowing she was scheming her next move. The silence didn't last long. Soon, the telltale flash of red and blue lights painted the walls. The police had arrived. I opened the door to find 2 officers standing on the porch. One of them, Heather, was a familiar face from high school. Her partner was a broad-shouldered man who looked less than thrilled to be there. They both carried the tense air of responding to a domestic disturbance call. "Good evening, officers," I said, keeping my tone light. "Let me guess, a complaint about a disturbance?" Heather nodded, her expression neutral. "Michael, your wife claims you threatened her." I stepped aside, motioning for them to enter. "Come on in, Coffee." They declined, their unease evident. She says you told her you'd ruined her life after she mentioned leaving you. Heather said, I feigned shock. Quite the accusation. Wouldn't making a false report be a serious matter? It would. Her partner replied, his tone cautious. Do you have any evidence to refute her claims? I retrieved my phone and played a recording I had taken earlier. The officers exchanged dark looks as Addison's voice rang out, her threats clear and unmistakable. Well, Heather's partner said, exhaling heavily, this changes things. You could definitely file for a restraining order with this. Heather nodded. You two shouldn't be anywhere near each other. Secure your house tonight and file the paperwork first thing tomorrow. If she shows up again, call us as they turn to leave. Heather paused, fixing me with a stern look. Michael, I remember you could get hot-headed back in high school. Keep your temper in check and let the courts handle this. Yes, ma'am, I said, smirking. Sweet cheeks, her brows shot up. Excuse me? Sorry, I said. Feigning innocence. Old habits. I'm an officer, sweet. Her partner chuckled as they walked away. Sweet cheeks, huh? He muttered to her. She didn't dignify it with a response. While I was occupied with the police, Addison was plotting her next move. Unbeknownst to me, she had slipped into the garage, determined to take my car and leave. But when she realized her keys were still on the kitchen counter, her frustration reached a boiling point. She turned her attention to my old SUV, affectionately nicknamed the Monster. The Monster was a beast, a 1989 full-size SUV with a 454 engine and four-wheel drive. It wasn't her first choice, but desperation made her bold. She climbed inside, started it up, and hit the garage opener button, oblivious to the fact that I had disconnected the opener chain as a precaution. Believing the door was rising, she hit the gas. The SUV roared to life, slamming through the still-closed garage door and straight into one of the parked patrol cars outside. The impact was deafening, sending the car skidding a few feet and leaving the SUV partially lodged in the remains of the door. Heather had been reaching for the patrol car's door when the crash occurred, and the chaos narrowly missed her. Her partner wasn't so lucky. He was thrown 10 feet down the driveway, landing in a heap with a bloodied face and a clearly broken nose. The sound of the crash was deafening. I rushed outside to see the Monster wedged in the shattered remains of the garage door, its rear bumper pressed against the now-dented patrol car. The air reeked of gasoline and scorched rubber. Heather's partner, Officer Jones, lay sprawled on the driveway, blood dripping from his nose and staining the pavement. Heather, miraculously unscathed, was frozen in shock, her hand hovering inches from the patrol car's door handle. When she realized what had just happened, her expression morphed into one of pure fury. Without hesitation, she stormed toward the SUV, yanked Addison out by her hair, and slammed her against the vehicle. Are you out of your mind? She roared, her voice echoing in the still night. Addison groaned, dazed but otherwise unharmed, her defiance momentarily dimmed by the sheer force of Heather's anger. Heather snapped handcuffs on her wrists and barked in her radio. Officer down. Immediate backup needed at 411 Elm Drive. We got a situation here. I rushed to Officer Jones, carefully cradling his head to prevent further injury. His eyes fluttered open briefly before closing again, his face contorted in pain. Blood continued to pool around his head, and I tilted him slightly to ensure his airway remained clear. Minutes later, the wail of sirens announced the arrival of reinforcements. The scene quickly turned chaotic as additional officers and an ambulance pulled up. Heather was barking orders, her face red with barely contained rage. Addison, now cuffed and seated on the curb, glared at me as if I were the cause of her predicament. You're unbelievable, she spat. This is your fault. Sure, I replied coolly, because I made you drive to the garage door and crash into a patrol car. Her silence was telling. Heather accompanied Jones to the hospital, leaving the scene after providing a detailed statement. Addison was taken away in another ambulance from minor injuries caused by the SUV's airbag deployment. I spent the next hour recounting the events to detectives, including how Addison had threatened to falsely accuse me earlier in the evening. The police chief, an old acquaintance who'd once coached my high school baseball team, arrived midway through my statement. He listened intently before shaking his head. "Michael, you've had a hell of a night. Jones should be fine. He'll need some stitches and a reset nose, but it doesn't look life-threatening. As for your wife, well, how do you even charge someone with sheer stupidity?" I allowed myself a small smile. I guess that's for the courts to decide. Addison's reckless actions didn't just damage property and endanger lives. They also set the tone for what was to come. She was released on bail the following day, but not before draining our joint bank account to cover her legal fees and repay her parents who had posted her bond. The $1,000 left in the account was hardly enough to cover basic expenses, but I wasn't concerned. I had already secured my finances in anticipation of her unpredictability. The restraining order ensured all communication went through our attorneys, which, as far as I was concerned, was a blessing. At our first legal meeting, her lawyer presented a long list of demands: the house, half its value, and reimbursement for various purchases. My lawyer, armed with meticulous documentation, dismantled each claim with surgical precision. "The house belongs to Michael's father," my lawyer explained, presenting the deed. It was never a marital asset. Addison's frustration was palpable, but she refused to back down. She demanded repayment for shared expenses, only for my lawyer to counter with evidence that I had personally covered the costs. Each rebuttal chipped away at her case, leaving her increasingly cornered. The courtroom became a battlefield, though Addison's case was weak from the start. Each demand she made was countered with evidence my lawyer had meticulously prepared. Every shared expense she claimed was disproven with receipts and bank statements from my personal account. Her frustration boiled over during one session, leading to an outburst that only further damaged her credibility. "I should have known you'd planned this," she shouted, her voice echoing in the courtroom. "You've always been calculating." I sat silently, my expression neutral. The judge gave her a pointed look and said, "Miss Addison, I suggest you control your tone if you want me to take your concerns seriously." By the end of the proceedings, Addison's demands crumbled under the weight of her own mistakes. The house remained in my father's name, and her claim to it was dismissed. The judge offered her one concession. She could keep the money she had drained from our joint account, provided she signed the divorce papers without further objections. Seething, Addison had no choice but to agree. The gavel struck, and with it, my freedom became official. The court's decision wasn't just a legal victory. It was a vindication of everything I had endured. The days after the divorce were quieter, but they were far from peaceful. Addison faced charges for filing a false police report and endangering an officer with her reckless actions. She caught a break, managing to avoid jail time in exchange for a year of probation and mandatory counseling. From a distance, I watched as she struggled to rebuild her life. About a month after the divorce was finalized, I ran into her at a local coffee shop. To my surprise, she asked if we could talk. Reluctantly, I agreed, curious about what she had to say. "Why were you so cruel to me?" she asked, her voice softer than I'd expected. I leaned back in my chair, studying her carefully. "I could ask you the same thing, Addison. Why drag things out? Why not just tell me when you decided you were done?" She looked down at her coffee, her fingers tracing the edge of the cup. "I wasn't happy," she admitted after a long pause. "I hated losing the house and the fire. I hated moving here. I hated everything. And instead of talking to me about it, you made those last months unbearable." I said, my voice steady but firm, "You wanted to hurt me, didn't you?" Her silence was answer enough. Finally, she nodded. "I blamed you for everything, and I wanted you to feel what I felt. I see now that it was wrong, but I can't undo it." "You're right," I said, standing. "You can't, but maybe you can learn from it. Years passed, and life moved on. Addison remarried twice, eventually settling into a quieter life with someone who seemed to ground her. Meanwhile, I found peace in rebuilding. I reconnected with Heather, the officer who had once been my high school classmate, and over time, our friendship deepened into something more. Heather and I married 9 months after our first date. She was everything Addison wasn't: kind, loyal, and fiercely supportive. Together, we built a life filled with joy and purpose. We moved into a spacious farmhouse inherited from her parents, a home that became the center of countless happy memories. Today, as I watch our daughter Kelly walk down the aisle, I'm reminded of how far I've come. The house that once symbolized so much pain is now hers, a wedding gift that represents a fresh start. Heather and I have plans to celebrate our 25th anniversary with a European cruise, a dream she's had for years. As I look at her now, holding a glass of water and playfully wagging a small blue pill in her hand, I can't help but laugh. Life is a way of throwing curveballs. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's this: the strength to rebuild is always within reach. And sometimes, the best chapters are the ones you never saw coming.